For decades, nuclear energy was fading. Too costly, too risky, too feared. But the world has changed. As global warming accelerates and artificial intelligence devours electricity, the demand for clean, constant power is exploding. From aging reactors being revived in America to data centers powered by next-generation designs, nuclear is no longer a relic of the past, it's becoming the power source of the future. Tech giants like Google are betting on it. Innovators like Bill Gates are rebuilding it.
We wouldn't do this if it didn't make sense for our business.
Well, there's certainly a number of countries, including the United States, where both the public attitudes and the level of investment in nuclear fission are quite positive.
The question is no longer if nuclear energy will return, but how fast it can save us. This is the nuclear comeback, where climate, technology, and ambition collide.
Aging reactors, energy prices, disasters. Nuclear power has been falling out of favor in the US for decades, but the conversation is changing. The intensifying threat of global warming and the explosion of AI is boosting the outlook of nuclear energy. This is an inflection point.
But we will get to the point that by 2050 we have zero emissions.
More than 100 nations have set lofty net zero targets, forcing the world to weigh the inherent risks and high cost of atomic power, which has no carbon emissions. That includes the United States.
The climate change moment is upon us now, and we need to meet that moment today and decarbonize our grid. Solar power, wind power, battery storage, they should go as fast as they physically can. And even that's not going to be fast enough. So now we need to complement it with other tools like nuclear power.
When you start talking about decarbonizing our economy by 2050, you realize that's a huge challenge. You really need all of those technologies to come together to meet those kinds of goals. I think nuclear plays a very significant role in fighting climate change. It is already the largest source of clean electricity, and I think it'll continue to grow in that area.
If the United States wants to revive its nuclear industry, it will take a panoramic effort. That includes maintaining aging reactors, building new ones, and fostering various startups. But the country faces a gauntlet of issues in order to convert that enthusiasm into results. The US first commercialized nuclear fission energy in the 1950s. It was a remarkable feat of engineering to capture energy created by splitting uranium.
Most of the plants, they started building them in the late 60s and into the 1970s. At its peak, we had 112 operating nuclear reactors. And in 1979, we had the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident, and the US nuclear industry pretty much ground to a halt.
3 Mile Island caused widespread panic at the time, and though the crisis is now declared over, it's left a question mark over the whole future of the American power industry.
We saw 13 reactors shut down from 2013 to 2022, mostly for economic reasons, because nuclear power plants, they're expensive to operate, and natural gas was becoming cheaper, wind and solar were becoming more common and cheaper.
Today, the US has 94 operating reactors, generating around 20% of the country's electricity. If the US wants to increase its nuclear power output, the first step is maintaining or even reopening aging reactors. Oconee Nuclear Station in South Carolina was part of that first wave of nuclear plants. Its first reactor began operation in 1973.
The Oconee plant in South Carolina, for a long time, was the biggest nuclear power plant in the United States. It's your standard light water reactor. That's the conventional model that we're using in all of the power plants in the United States today. Nuclear power plants in the US get licensed for 40 years. When they started building them in the 60s and 70s, that was kind of the expectation. Let's take them for 40 years and see what happens after that. Most of them have now been extended even longer than that.
Today, utility companies are investing in their nuclear plants like Oconee so they can run for 80 years and maybe even longer. But back in the early 2010s, that wasn't the case. The industry was beleaguered by competition from cheaper natural gas and renewable wind and solar, and rattled by the disaster at Fukushima. No one was fighting to keep an old nuclear plant open.
While we were seeing all of these plants close, the other side of the coin is that we weren't seeing any new construction of new power plants either.
President George W. Bush launched the Nuclear Power 2010 program as a response to that downturn. Only 2 utilities heeded his call, and one of them reached the finish line. Southern Company completed their expansion of Vogel in early 2024 with reactors 3 and 4, but it came in 7 years behind schedule and more than double its $14 billion budget. Meanwhile, dozens of nuclear reactors were shelved by investors who faced ballooning budgets. It's remarkable that 2 reactors were completed at the Vogel site. They might be the last large reactors built in the U.S. for a long time.
So the construction certainly did have challenges. This was a first-of-a-kind nuclear unit in the United States. We had to restart a supply chain, retrain workers on the specifics of nuclear construction, and then an unforeseen global pandemic occurred. Our primary contractor filed bankruptcy, so certainly these were challenges, some of which we expected, some of which we didn't, but we navigated them. I think it's absolutely a monumental accomplishment, and it's so important to prove that building nuclear power in the United States is possible. And I do hope that other utilities and companies in the country, as well as around the world, will continue to benefit from the lessons learned from Vogel 3 and 4 and build more nuclear generation.
There's a lot of interest in whether we can build another one of these big nuclear power plants in the United States. But the utilities, they're the ones who would have to write the check. And they are not lining up to take on one of these projects. They're wary of a price tag that would be in the tens of billions of dollars.
If Vogel is the last big nuclear reactor built in the United States, startups are trying to fill in the gap. They are developing new, smaller reactor designs for the next generation of the country's nuclear fleet.
They called SMRs, that's a small modular reactor. The basic idea is that you mass produce the components in a factory, and then you can put them on a truck or put them on a barge and deliver them to the site where it's all bolted together. So that's supposed to be faster, easier, and most importantly, cheaper. Kairos is one of at least a dozen companies that are developing new reactor technologies. They're developing a completely different technology. It uses molten fluoride salt as a coolant instead of water. But the key is that they can build them in a factory and send them out to wherever they need to be installed. The next step for Kairos is going to be at Oak Ridge Labs in Tennessee, where they're going to build their first test reactor.
Experts predict we'll have a functioning small modular reactor by the mid-2030s. Bill Gates recently announced TerraPower, a startup he founded, broke ground for its first commercial reactor in Wyoming. A leading project from NuScale was terminated in late 2023, a victim of inflation and elevated interest rates. The US government is vital to the success and potential growth of the nuclear industry. Its support in approval licenses and funding is the only way these projects ever reach the finish line. Looking forward to the new administration, Republicans have generally supported nuclear energy, but President-elect Donald Trump has given mixed signals.
These things ended up costing $25 billion, and one of them never got opened.
So it's been an extraordinary change from when I grew up in small town Sterling, Illinois, to, really seeing this renaissance of interest.
Especially for someone who's been in the industry for a while, because we went through this period, 2009, 2010, where the nuclear renaissance phrase got thrown around a lot. And it didn't come to fruition at that point in time. But I will say I am very optimistic.
So whether it is our involvement with the Vogel nuclear plant and seeing that all the way through, or restarting nuclear power plants, or building new nuclear power plants using next generation technologies, I think we end up being a sounding board for the entire nuclear industry. Today, I would say nuclear power has just as much support as every other clean technology. We need to get to a place where independent power producers in deregulated states can build a reactor. The Loan Programs Office really is here to serve folks who decide to try to borrow money from our office. But ultimately, the decision around whether we're actually in a nuclear renaissance is the decision of the utility companies and others who have to come to us for a loan.
It's difficult to predict if the refound enthusiasm for nuclear power will be matched by utilities and entrepreneurs. The demand for carbon-free electricity is increasing, but it's difficult to stomach a multi-billion-dollar bill and decades-long timetable for a nuclear reactor. Experts say the upswing in nuclear power plant construction needs to continue to both meet net zero emissions goals by 2050 and ultimately to help smooth the world's transition to renewable energy.
So even with all the excitement for nuclear energy these days, there are still some important environmental groups like Sierra Club, Greenpeace. They are staunchly opposed to nuclear energy. They're still concerned about all of the risks.
Nuclear power and radioactive waste are inherently dangerous. The risks of atomic reactor meltdowns are radioactivity escaping into the environment to contaminate the drinking water supply, contaminate the food supply, contaminate the air that you breathe. And it's been known for decades that any exposure to ionizing radioactivity, no matter how small the dose, carries a risk of cancer causation. Our movement across the country and across the world supports renewables complemented by efficiency and storage. That covers the reliability aspect. In fact, internationally and in the United States, renewables like wind and solar are growing by leaps and bounds, where the nuclear power industry has enjoyed the lion's share of subsidies.
So when I started writing about nuclear energy in 2019, the only real story was which reactor was going to get shut down next because they were so expensive to operate. But today the narrative has completely reversed. Now the story is who's going to extend their license for another 20 years? Who's going to be the first to build another big nuclear power plant?
There's been a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of cheerleading in the nuclear power industry. What the country needs to do is to stop, build a reactor, and generate electricity. There's a real regulatory and social and political gauntlet that nuclear power plant developers need to run through. I remain optimistic about nuclear power, but it's taking much longer than I had expected. And I'm concerned about rising costs due to inflation and high interest rates. What I see happening in the next 5 years is the reopening of several retired nuclear power plants, perhaps 3. And after 2030, I anticipate that we'll start to see some of the advanced and small modular reactors coming online. Right now, most of the interest in the nuclear space surrounds fission, but one cannot disregard all the companies that have raised about $7.1 billion to commercialize fusion. Fusion offers a very, very promising solution as well. And that could be an additional nuclear technology that contributes to address challenges of climate change.
And I guess that the best starting point, because it's well documented the terms of the deal, SMRs and what they are, is whether it meaningfully changes the trajectory of meeting your power needs, but also your targets for climate as well.
Well, the world needs more carbon-free energy, and this agreement that we signed with Kairos is an important milestone in what's been a 15-year journey at Google to make the transition to clean energy. It's our first nuclear energy deal, and we feel that nuclear is a very important technology for going carbon-free for offices, data centers, communities where we operate, because it's an always-on carbon-free energy resource.
I'm very interested in the technology. You know I am. But I'm also interested in the economics and the math. Are you able to say, even if it's an estimate, kind of where you see the dollar per megawatt hour being by 2030, 2035, when these come online?
Well, I can't talk about the specifics of this deal, but what's interesting about it is we didn't do a deal for just one reactor. It's actually for a series of reactors, what we call an order book. And that repeatability helps to drive down costs and helps to take the technology to scale faster.
Your focus is eliminating carbon emissions by 2030. Does this get you there, Michael?
That's right, Caroline. We have a goal as a company to be 24/7 carbon-free in everywhere we operate, in every location, every hour of the day. And it's a huge challenge. We've actually been in this space for 15 years in terms of doing wind and solar, large deals. We're one of the largest corporate purchasers of wind and solar on the planet. We've signed over 100 deals. But we know that to get to carbon-free 24 hours a day, we're going to need more technologies than just wind and solar. The wind doesn't blow all the time, the sun doesn't shine all the time. And what's great about technologies like advanced nuclear is that they provide a more always-on resource. So it's a very big part of our path to 24/7 carbon-free energy.
But it takes time. And right now, AI, generative AI, the training of it is in the here and now. Do you have the energy infrastructure necessary to satisfy that demand?
Yes, we do, and it's why we're making big bets like we are on nuclear, but we're also still betting big on wind and solar and storage. We signed over 4 gigawatts of deals just last year, the most we've ever signed in a single year. And now we're inking new agreements with utilities to develop a portfolio of technologies that can meet our 24/7 carbon-free needs. So we're both betting short-term and long-term.
I know you won't give me a dollar per megawatt hour figure, but you do expect the SMRs to be competitive and of value versus solar and wind and the other technologies you outlined?
Absolutely, Ed. We wouldn't do this if it didn't make sense for our business. And, one of the things that I think we ought to really think about in how we value these approaches is the always-on nature of nuclear technology.
Hours.
And it delivers a lot of value, and you can put it anywhere. And so that, again, is very good for the business.
But can I just jump in really quick and ask you, your job is really interesting because you are responsible for the energy needs. If you're not calculating the cost per megawatt hour, do you have a clear figure in your head about the energy need over a 5-year or 10-year time horizon?
Yeah. Well, we've been doing this for, like I said, 15 years. We have a good sense of how our demand is going to grow. We have a good sense of the portfolio of resources that we need. And we're making decisions that make sense for the business and make sense for our growth as a company. So we feel we're on a good path.
Look, it's busy out there in nuclear. Never have we talked about it more. And the Amazon deal, for example. Look, these are companies that we've not really heard of. Kairos Power, the private X Energy. Are there enough startups, enough companies building what you need right now to partner with?
It reminds me of the early days of wind and solar. We were one of the pioneers in signing corporate PPA agreements to buy these technologies. And there were not a lot of players in the early days of those as well. But now, with this new set of technologies that we're going to need to get to 24/7 carbon-free energy, it's not just nuclear, it's enhanced geothermal, it's long-duration storage. And so it's great to see others getting in the game. The more the merrier. I'd like to see 100 more companies doing nuclear deals from what we've seen this week.
We're running out of time, but so you will look at geothermal. And can you give us a proportion of what you see the contribution of nuclear, geothermal and solar?
Yeah, actually, geothermal was one of the first advanced energy deals that we did. We signed a deal in 2021 to do a project in Nevada. It's now scaled to a deal that's 25 times bigger than that original project. So we've got experience in dealing with these new technologies, and we're super excited about the potential for nuclear.
Hi, Bill. Thank you again for doing the New Economy Forum. We'll begin, I think, on greenery. And I've just read your new State of the Transition report. And in that, you start with a bold claim that basically the climate business in 2024 reminds you or seems at the same inflection point that medicine was back in 2020 when you began the whole vaccines drive. And your argument is that we now have most of the technologies we need to fight climate change or to deal with climate. And I wondered, perhaps you can just give us a couple of examples. I know that you talk about a lot of technologies like clean hydrogen, aviation fuel, and so on, but just give us a couple of examples of why you think that, because it's a very big claim.
Well, my key theory of change on climate is that if the clean approach, the green approach, is more expensive, that we won't get global adoption. Perhaps rich countries will subsidize clean approaches, but as you get into the middle-income countries like Brazil, India, and others, they would say, hey, we're not responsible for the historic emissions, and so slowing down our providing basic capabilities to our population, that we shouldn't be impeded. And so the way to square this is to innovate in all the areas of emissions so that the new approach that's clean costs less. That's either a zero green premium or literally a negative green premium. And that's what Breakthrough Energy was founded to do. We have 130 companies. A good example is one that's working on the way that steel is made. They're called Boston Metals. They're actually working with partners in Brazil to build a plant there that looks like it'll be able to make very competitive steel, but in a very, very clean way. We have geothermal, company called Fervo. We have people who make windows called Luxwall that means you don't have to heat or cool your building as much. So these 130 companies are driving forward this innovative approach, and we still have a lot of work to do to take things that some of which are just at the lab, some of which are still quite expensive, but volume is needed to bring the cost down, like we saw with solar panels and batteries. But we're on our way. We've got the IQ of the world, and in every one of the areas of emission, I see a path to zero, which means we can get adoption where we need it.
I'm quite interested. You've backed quite a lot of green startups. There are a lot of people in this audience who are involved in that industry. Some of them get to scale, some of them don't. Have you reached any conclusion about what is the factor for success?
Well, everything is very domain dependent. I had to learn a lot about the history of steel making or different approaches for making cement, to understand, okay, why has that stayed the same for so long? And now that we're getting lots of new people looking at that, what are these new techniques? Teaming up with large companies, working in multiple geographies. It's very science-based. It's, fun to meet those innovators. It's more capital intensive than, say, the digital revolution. And, we can't underestimate that means that the scale is tough. We can run into geopolitical barriers sometimes, but on the whole, even though we won't meet the highest goals, we will start to get emissions down, and we'll avoid this being the primary thing that's slowing down human development.
About nuclear, you've been a big backer of nuclear through things. I looked up kind of Google, Amazon, Microsoft, as you know. They're all beginning to invest money in nuclear things. Do you think the wind is changing? I suppose that's a bad metaphor, but do you think that there is a change in the way people are looking at this?
Well, there's certainly a number of countries, including the United States, where both the public attitudes and the level of investment in nuclear fission are quite positive. At the COP28, a lot of countries came together and talked about tripling nuclear over the future. So that's very different than going into decline. There's a big challenge, though, which is those third-generation plants. They have a lot of pressure. They're very expensive. They're very complex. So there's a question, can we get to this fourth generation? And so you have a number of companies trying to usher in much simpler designs, including the one I'm involved in called TerraPower. There's several other companies doing that. But yes, the fact that the tech companies want to be customers for green energy, and at least for a period of time, they're willing to pay a bit of a premium. And as the volume of reactors go up, then that premium goes away. That is extremely helpful to reboot the nuclear industry around these fourth-generation plants.
There is an issue, though, isn't there? That a lot of the attention has been on small modular reactors or kind of reviving old ones rather than building big new ones. Is that a problem? It looks at it from the outside, but I don't know.
Well, if you get small, you can do a lot of your labor off-site, which is advantageous, but it also means your efficiency is a lot less. And so the approach TerraPower is using is to have a medium-sized reactor, 345 megawatt electric. In our roadmap, if utilities do want big ones, those are somewhat more efficient. But, first we want to build dozens of our medium-sized reactor, and we've been able to move some of the labor off-site, although we still have some on-site. But size, it's very tricky to get the efficiency as you get small, because it's the kind of the volume of the reactor is your value and the surface area is your cost. So different people are taking different approaches, and of course we have digital design and simulation that is letting us build far, far simpler plants than ever before.
What about fusion? I know it's a question I think I probably ask you once every 5 years. Do you think that is, it always seems to be 5 years away, or at least that, is it now getting closer at all? There have been one or two people recently suddenly saying there's possibilities.
Yeah, so Breakthrough Energy, where almost all my climate work is, and I'm the largest investor in, we funded 4 different fusion companies. The one that's furthest along is pretty fantastic, called Commonwealth Fusion Systems. That's a spin-off essentially from MIT, and they're hard at work building their prototype facility outside of Boston. And so it's, you could say it's about 6 to 10 years behind the 4th generation fission, but it has a lot of advantages, and over time it could be even less expensive. And so we're backing these companies, and they're even using very advanced software to simulate how they work. So in the long run, fission and fusion will be a substantial part of power generation, complementing the renewables that are being built at high speed.
Can I just contrast, because you've sort of alluded to it a couple of times, the kind of gap between all the kind of business optimism, the scientific possibilities that are now opening up, with the political realities which seem to be going in the opposite direction. Just to give you an example, you played quite a big role in getting the Inflation Reduction Act through in America. You personally went and persuaded Joe Manchin. It was a big deal. And there was kind of greenery within that, as we both know. A good portion of that could well get dumped if Trump comes in. What do you think is the most endangered technology out of the stuff that managed to get through under that bill?
It'll be interesting because, what the Congress will see is that bill is causing a lot of projects to be built in red states. And so ideally we'll get some bipartisan defense of what's being done there. I do think nuclear is particularly bipartisan because it has to do with energy security as well as climate. But you could have some things like the electric vehicle tax credit or the green electricity tax credits. You could have them come under attack. I think they're a good thing. I think they're ushering in new industries. The general idea that taxpayers are going to pay a lot of extra money for products because they want to reduce emissions, that has been pushed hard enough that there really is a backlash. We see that in Europe, we see that in the US, and that's why this theory of innovation is the only way you square the imperative to get rid of the emissions, but without having people say, hey, I'm not going to pay for it. And actually, that can even influence elections if you push too hard.
Do you think that thing, though, on the demand side, in a strange way, the demand kick has been given? Now these technologies are underway. It wouldn't be terrible it wouldn't help if they went away, but it would if those kind of reliefs were taken away.
Well, you have different levels of maturity, and so I'd say that electric vehicles, even without the subsidies, over time they are going, even for the people who park on the street, the low end, they will get to a zero green premium. You have things, particularly industrial emissions like steel, cement, that we're just building the pilot plants now, and so without governmental policy and support, the transition of the industrial emissions would slow down a lot, and that's very unfortunate if that takes place. Likewise, in transportation, airlines are the toughest part of all of the emissions, and they're, without support, that'll get pushed back.
Can I ask you one kind of strangely capitalism-related question? I mean, you have arguably been one of the world's, well, you've definitely been one of the world's most successful capitalists of the past 25, 30, 40 years. Last week, I sat on a stage with Donald Trump, and he said that he wanted to introduce tariffs, 10, 20% on everywhere, and his argument was this was very good for American business. In your experience, does that make sense?
No, it's certainly not the case, and the difficulty of convincing voters that free trade is overwhelmingly to their benefit. It's unfortunate how difficult it is to make that case. And so, I understand a politician who chooses to take advantage of that, but, we will suffer overall. Welfare will improve less, as not only will, if the U.S. puts tariffs on, of course, other people will put tariffs on as well, and the economic dynamism, speed of innovation will be significantly slowed.
Just to push you on that dynamism point, it's very easy to make the argument that this means higher prices for consumers, but this issue of dynamism, the sort of, you've been involved in entrepreneurship, these things most of your life. If you have less foreign competition, less foreign goods, that must have an impact on it. I know it's back to a creed you've believed in, but in practice, is that argument possible to make to voters?
Well, we should find articulate politicians who can make the case. If you take most of the industries I think about, like, inventing a new drug or writing a new piece of software or birthing a new climate technology, you have these gigantic fixed costs. And the fact that you can do that work and then sell it on a global basis means that everybody's getting faster innovation and lower prices. And if you start to fragment markets because of either tariffs or regulatory barriers to that trade, it absolutely takes away the lower prices and high-speed innovation.
You mentioned health. It struck me, maybe this is unfair, but health is kind of the opposite to climate, is that at least there were incredible health gains in the early 2000s. It seems to have stalled a bit. What's needed to create another global health boom?
Well, I'm actually quite optimistic. Both the diseases in lower income countries and the diseases in rich countries, we are seeing incredible advances, whether it's obesity drugs, long-acting drugs. Gene editing is still super expensive, but the Gates Foundation is putting a lot of money into trying to get that from millions of dollars to hundreds of dollars, so we can take a disease like sickle cell that's prominent in Africa. And as we do that, it'll benefit all the world's health systems. And then, of course, AI will be applied in health in the upstream discovery piece to speed up new drugs, but it'll also be applied in the downstream delivery, sitting in the sessions with doctors, helping with follow-up, helping with paperwork. And so I think the health sector will be an exemplar that AI can improve things quite dramatically.
There's one thing which is a little bit similar is that issue, and you did it in your Netflix series, this issue of trust, is that there are these things that appear very logical to do with health, and yet people don't seem to believe it, COVID being the obvious example. How do we deal with this sort of deficit of trust when it comes to health? Is it just to do with a deficit of trust in governments, or is it broader than that?
Well, certainly I never expected, as the pandemic came along, that many people had warned about, the idea that people would reach for oversimplistic explanations, like attacking either myself or Tony Fauci, or attacking the idea of vaccines. I wouldn't have expected that, and certainly a lot of people particularly older people who should have been vaccinated were not. So, those rumors, literally caused hundreds of thousands of deaths. I'm hopeful with that out of the way that we can go back to, a more scientific way of looking at health innovation. When people see the effects of things like these obesity drugs, it should remind them that, we can improve health pretty dramatically.
I agree. The obesity drugs are a very good example in one direction. On the other hand, you have stuff about, hurricanes and things like that. You still see that basic trust that people used to have in, quote unquote, scientists and government it's amazingly small compared with what it was 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, there's like these latest hurricanes, some people blame me for those too. I'm very busy. But hopefully, the basic decisions about what's safe and what's beneficial, we maintain that. And, I think positive progress will help get people back, looking at what experts are telling them the truth is.
One quick thing on health, the mosquito-borne diseases seem to be a little bit back on the rise, dengue and the West Nile stuff. People, are you worried about that? I mean, it just seems to be a slight blip in an otherwise very positive picture.
Yeah, of course, the biggest part of that, which is kind of invisible in middle income and rich countries, is the malaria burden, which is killing about 600,000 kids a year. Yeah. Where you are in Brazil, dengue's gone up somewhat. We do have new tools to reduce mosquito populations, one that's still in the lab called Gene Drive that the Gates Foundation funds and should help us with all those mosquito-borne diseases. What we see is when you get a lot of flooding, which you get a bit more of with climate change, mosquitoes really thrive. And so places like Pakistan, where you have very little malaria, then when they had the flooding, now it's come back in a pretty big way. And so, that innovation pipeline is coming along. It should get even more money, but we will be able to get rid of those vector-borne diseases in countries that want to embrace these new tools.
I'll ask you one last question about Brazil. I mean, this is a place we've heard where, especially on the climate side, a very, very high proportion, probably higher than anywhere else, certainly above 90%, coming from renewable sources. Do you see Brazil as the center of this climate? It seems to be the center of both the pain in the Amazon, but also on the creative side. Is that something you've been following?
Well, certainly at the UN General Assembly, the Gates Foundation had our goalkeepers event, and I gave an award to President Lula for the work they've done in reducing malnutrition. We've been talking with Brazil a lot about COP30 that's coming up, and that'll be a very important milestone both for climate mitigation and climate adaptation. Brazil has done some good pioneering things on mitigation. The deforestation, it's important that get under control both for Brazil itself and for the world. So there's a lot being learned there. As I said, one of our best breakthrough companies is building a steel plant with partners in Brazil. So yes, agriculture innovation with Embrapa, Brazil is very strong. So it's fantastic, that the issue is a very important issue, and it deals with kind of the equity things that Brazil's been a global leader on.
Just one last thing on that, particularly on Brazil. Are you now much more, it sounds like you're more optimistic about Brazil than maybe if you and I talked about it 20, 30 years ago. It's a more positive story?
Well, Brazil's got a lot of assets. And, it's kind of a mixed story because they've had, challenges with governance and, who knows, they're like the U.S. They have a party that's sort of against all climate things and for Amazon destruction, and you have a party who cares about that. So, I'm not an expert on what the balance will end up being over time. The whole world has this problem that we do need to invest in. Amazon forest destruction. We're very good at measuring it now because of satellite systems, but the exact policies that will get us there, still somewhat challenging, particularly as you get different parties in power.
Bill, thank you very much for talking to us again. Covered many, many subjects. Thank you very much on behalf of everyone here. Thank you.
Thank you.